Thank you very much, Maura. So we have 20 minutes for questions, which is great. So who would like to start for any of the speakers? Yes. Ricardo.
Linda, I have a question for Peter, one from Lion and one for the whole panel. I'll start with Peter. Hi, Peter. This is Ricardo. We've been exchanging mails very frequently. There's something that puzzles me from the snus epidemiology data. And the bit that really puzzles me is the COPD data. COPD in Sweden is exactly the same as in the rest of Europe. And if it is true that cigarette smoking is causing COPD, I would be expecting a big reduction in the prevalence of COPD, which doesn't happen. My answer to that question is that probably we don't know very much about COPD and the mechanism of COPD. For example, in India, biomass fuel is the main cause for COPD. Is there anything like that in Sweden?
I don't know. I've looked at actual studies of COPD and snus, and I haven't seen any association between it. I mean, the point you make that COPD levels are similar in Sweden to the rest of the population, Europe. I wasn't aware of. So I can't really comment. I'm certainly happy to go away and have a look at it, but I can't comment at the moment. Sorry.
Fantastic. I'll get back to you privately on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was a bit surprised when Lion presented the ECO data. So here we are, a bunch of respected scientists from all over the world. We really need to reconcile that, because by looking at Moira's presentation, it seems that we are reassured that ECO is not there, combustion is not there. And Lion is presenting that quite worrying histogram. And I'm sure many people here sitting in the audience has this lingering question in their mind, and what's going on? Do we have any possible explanation in order to reconcile this massive whopping divergence? The only one I can think of is dual use. Maybe they were occasionally smoking a cigarette just prior to ECO measurements. Leon, what do you think?
I mean, parsimonious explanation would be to say that the analysis was incorrect in the published data. As I was saying, the average value was 2.97% carboxyhemoglobin in the Lüdecke paper, which is nearly twice the cutoff of 1.5% that's usually used in clinical trials. But the same level, oddly enough, was observed in people who apparently had stopped smoking completely, which is inconsistent with existing data. So I don't know what the explanation could be, but somebody in the front might want to give an answer.
Well, so if I may answer the question, I'm Manuel Peitsch, by the way, Chief Scientific Officer for PMI. There are a couple of things that are intriguing in the way you have done the comparison. In the Lüdecke paper, as well as in Haziza et al., a couple of papers in other studies, which are 5-day studies, we compare COHB as well as all the other HPHC markers to smoking abstinence in the same study. So the 2.97% COHB in those people who have switched for the duration of the study completely to THS or ICOS compares to the 3.04 plus minus standard deviation in those people who actually stopped smoking for the duration of the study. And this is radically different from what you see in those people who continue smoking. So if you take Wald et al. 1981, which basically states that ppm of carbon monoxide is equals of 5.09 times the percentage of COHB plus 2.34, you would actually see that the 17.45 that you calculated, which is correct, compares to 31 point something in those people who are smoking cigarettes. Conversely, if I take your numbers for CC, that means combustible cigarettes, and I reverse calculate using the Wald relationship, Those people don't have any carboxyhemoglobin in their blood to speak of. So something doesn't really compute in the analysis. So let's compare the comparable. Compare comparable at the level of the methodology as well as the way we analyze the data. And thereby, we will not confuse people with erroneous analysis. Thank you.
Okay, and I suspect
Can I
that...
just respond for 1 second? I mean, the thing is that, as I mentioned when I presented the data, that we shouldn't compare them directly. However, it remains the fact that in the published data, the carboxyhemoglobin levels are much higher. And both people who stopped smoking, people who have switched over to THS 2.2, compared with published data that's out there. So I cannot explain that finding, and it's rather odd. And I know that you have conducted studies in the absence of any oxygen to show that combustion can't be going on.
Exactly.
But the data are there, so I don't understand
the data are there, and compare the comparable. If we use a CRO, the CRO uses another CRO to do the analysis. It's all done in the same lab by an independent organization. Okay? I understand that there are differences in the absolute minimal level in non-smokers. That is correct. But that has to do with how different labs calibrate their measurements. That's all there is. So let's compare the things that are comparable.
Okay, so can I just suggest, if we stop that there, if that's okay. It's so important that we commission and conduct independent research to try and highlight these differences. Some of it's quite technical, and I'm sure we can continue this, and I'm sure we can continue on PubMed and other places. So that's very useful, and thank you for the questions, Ricardo. Can I open it up to any other questions for other speakers?
I need to make a comment.
Okay,
I think
quickly.
that we have wasted a lot of time trying to find out what was wrong in the X or the Y study.
Yeah.
We can very easily do a very simple clinical study measuring exhaled carbon monoxide before and after IQOS use. So we don't care if someone is a dual user or not. He's going to come and we're going to make a baseline measurement. We're going to give him an IQOS 1 stick to try, to use, and we're going to make it 5 minutes later, as is the recommendation from the ECO meter manufacturers. We know that with the tobacco cigarettes, they will go from 6, 7, if they have abstained, up to 25 or 30 ppm. We're going to see the difference very easily, instead of looking who did not calibrate.
Doing it in humans. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Konstantinos. Other questions here in the third row, the front. Sorry, okay. Sorry,
I had
Deborah
just
has
very
the microphone,
quickly,
so let's ask to go to Deborah.
Moira, I think that was an interesting discussion. It would be useful, Manuel, if you actually put that out in your explanation out in writing, because I think this is not a forum for understanding really detailed explanations. The question I had from Moira was that you showed partial and complete substitution. On that diagram, you didn't show the people who tried and not carried on using, and it would be really useful to get a sense of how that fits, because there are not just 2 categories, there are actually 3, aren't there?
Yeah. So absolutely, and I think this data is changing as we start to consolidate the presence in the countries that we're in. So we see that the time to switching, for example, in Japan has decreased very dramatically as the product has started to become more used among smokers. Yeah.
How many tried and then thought they didn't like it? That's what you weren't showing.
Yes. So I don't have the data in mind, but what I can tell you is that in those who have converted to the IQOS product, so they've converted just one second.
What about those who tried and didn't convert, either partially or completely? That's the question you haven't answered.
Yeah, we have published it. I just don't have it in my head. The ones who have converted, the number so far that we see that abandon the product after having converted is in the very low single-digit percentages. So we seem to be able to show now that once you've converted completely to the product, it's highly unlikely that you will go back to using conventional cigarettes.
Thank you, Maura.
The same happened with cigarettes too.
So we had a question in the third row, and then we'll go back to Caitlin behind you.
Hi, I'm Emily from Nottingham University in the UK. Moving away from figures for all the qualitative researchers out there. I'm currently analysing forum data, forum discussions between breastfeeding mothers about the use of either smoking whilst you're breastfeeding or vaping. And there's 2 points that I'd like to put to all of you. One is that these women are sharing quite a bit of evidence published by people like yourselves, but they are misinterpreting it. They are seeing your information about vaping and they are seeing the minute amounts of heavy metals, but it's not being translated to them that actually it's so much lower than cigarettes. All they're seeing is potential toxicants and potential carcinogenics. So a lot of women are coming to the conclusion that if they're going to relapse postpartum, which we know is extremely high, between 60 and 75% of women will relapse into smoking, they're saying it's better for their health, for their baby's health, and for the composition of their breast milk for them to relapse to smoking cigarettes, because the APA and the NHS state very openly that it is better to continue breastfeeding if you relapse to smoking. So their idea is it's better the devil you know, go to smoking, don't trust vaping, don't try it at all. So I suppose the question really is, what do we do as academics to kind of get this message across in a way that people understand when it's such a massive issue?
I think you're just raising a very crucial point of doing research and comparing any alternative product with a tobacco cigarette instead of the environmental air. For metal specifically, I did the risk assessment analysis in which I didn't compare it with tobacco cigarettes. I compared it with currently established safety limits, either for medicinal inhalers or for environmental occupational setting standards. And I used an extreme consumption of 1,200 puffs just to use something, an extreme scenario in terms of cigarette use. And I think that's something that's going to be needed. But and another thing that is missing is a risk assessment analysis, because we know that the presence of a chemical means nothing. So most of the literature is basically not doing two things. One is compared with tobacco cigarettes, and the second is do a risk assessment analysis. What does it mean finding the X amount of the X chemical?
Sorry, can I just add one more thing
Quickly,
to that?
Yeah.
Your paper is one of the ones that's actually shared an awful lot on Mumsnet and Baby Centre. They're not looking at the kind of the ratios and the relative risk. All they're seeing in the abstract is, this is what, we found these toxicants. They're not getting to the point where they're understanding that actually it's within the safe level or anything like that.
Can I just make a point there? I think there is a gap between the published academic press, the peer-reviewed literature, and how we try and use other agencies and ways of communication to get the message out to the public, which is why it's so important that we have information campaigns that are very clear that these are less harmful, safer products, and we are hoping we are going to have more of those in the future. And those should be the kinds of communications that we use with women, rather than having to unpick, I think, these individual papers.
I just want to make a point as well. So for the smoking toolkit study, we've seen an increase in harm perception regards to e-cigarettes, partly because of the rather odd press that has been published. And the most worrying thing is actually this is true not only for cigarette smokers, but also e-cigarette users. So that more and more e-cigarette users are starting to think, in the UK it's about 30 to 40% that e-cigarettes are as harmful as conventional cigarettes, which clearly is not the case. But I think it is also important, nonetheless, when you present data, to have both smokers as well as non-smokers. And as you will have seen, for instance, in my study, for a lot of these carcinogens and toxicants we looked at, the levels of e-cigarette users were exactly the same as for non-smokers. I mean, everything is risky, but clearly if it's the same level as non-smokers, it's probably quite a safe thing to do. I mean, water is risky. If you drink too much, you die.
Good point, Leon. Okay. Caitlin, and then I'll see if there's, and then Ron. So she's just 2 rows back.
Thank you, Caitlin Notley from the University of East Anglia. Thank you everyone for really fascinating and thought-provoking presentations. It's a question for Moira. As a social scientist, I'm particularly interested in user perceptions of reduced risk products. And I was interested in your risk continuum scale. I guess I was reflecting that in the current sort of historical climate, it's perhaps an assumption that the conventional cigarette is the preferred option of nicotine delivery, because certainly what we seem to be finding in our qualitative work is that ex-smokers who switch to vaping using an e-cigarette come to prefer that over any alternative form of nicotine delivery. So I wonder how you think that risk continuum scale may change in the context of vaping particularly.
I think you make a good point. And the scale that I showed, purely illustrative, is also to highlight that we believe this product is for current adult smokers who would otherwise continue smoking. It's not for vapers who've switched and have found a product that suits them. That's not the aim of this proposition. It's for smokers who potentially have tried electronic cigarettes and not found them satisfying. So I think it's a super important point. And also as a user of IQOS myself, I see the same perception that you're mentioning. So the idea of using a conventional cigarette to me now is ridiculous because my taste has changed. And we see that in the data that I just mentioned in answer to Deborah's question. Once you switch to a product, whether it be a vapor product or whether it be heated tobacco product, and if you're stuck with it and you're not using conventional cigarettes at all, that becomes your point of reference, not conventional cigarettes anymore.
Thank you, Maura. Ron.
Ron Bullen from Australia. Leon in his presentation presented some interesting data showing that in some cases fresh air or no exposure to nicotine is associated with higher levels or at least the same levels. But then you reported similarly percentage reductions where the percentage reduction to nothing would be less than 100%. So I think we need to think about how we deal with the ambient levels in terms of percentage reductions. And related to that, I think one of the things that seems to be missing, and I'd be interested in the comments of the panel, is what is the kind of exposure you get from passive smoking and how does that compare with the kind of exposures you get from vaping or from the heat-not-burn products? Because we now know quite a lot about the epidemiology of passive smoking, i.e. lower levels of exposure to these products, which may give us some better insights as to the likely harmfulness of these products compared with passive smoking. Thanks.
That's right. Who wants to take that? Maura? Yeah.
I can partially answer that question. We haven't done studies on humans looking at exposure, but what we have done is indoor air quality studies. So we've looked at both heated tobacco products and electronic cigarettes in an indoor environment. And we've measured for a total of, I think, 18 different harmful or potentially harmful chemicals. In the electronic cigarette study, we were only able to detect nicotine at very low level and glycerin at low level. For the heated tobacco product, we could detect only nicotine at levels much, much lower than those allowed by occupational health standards. And acetaldehyde, which as you know is a metabolite, many people in the room may be breathing out right now if they're up in the floor. And again, at levels much, much lower than those which are allowed under indoor air quality standards. I think it is important that we do studies looking at this from an exposure perspective. Obviously, the difficulty is ethical approval of exposing non-smokers to these products, but I think it is something that needs to be studied.
Ron, I think you made a very strong point about the need for biomarkers of exposure. What Leon said, to use another control group of non-smokers. Because I've seen even scientists discussing about reductions in biomarkers of exposure, but then saying that yes, but there is some exposure because these biomarkers exist, they are present in urine. And they miss the point that they are also present in non-smokers, not only former, but even never smokers, because of the ambient exposure from the ambient environment. So I think it's very important, specifically in these studies, to use a group of never smokers. Now, for biomarkers of exposure for passive, for people who are exposed passively to e-cigarettes, when you see biomarkers of exposure in the active user, similar to a non-smoker, I don't think there is any point in doing such a study for someone who is passively exposed to e-cigarettes. and maybe to IQOS 2 since there are so big reductions.
Yeah, my point was more about the comparison between the active exposures from vaping and heat not burn as compared with the passive exposures to smoking, because we know about the health harms of passive smoking, and that seems to be a more important comparison. I'm very convinced by the data to suggest that the exposures to passive vaping are fairly trivial.
Okay. We got time for one more question. Neil.
Neil Benowitz, University of California, San Francisco. So comment for, or some comments related to Leon's paper on dual use. One, I'd just like to make the comment that I think there's an important sort of cultural, societal factor in interpreting dual use. Depends what the expectation of the smokers are. In the US, for example, where there's much less support for the concept that e-cigarettes reduce harm, most dual use is not daily dual use. It's occasional use of e-cigarettes when you can't smoke cigarettes, and therefore most studies show very little reduction compared to cigarette smoking. If you're using e-cigarettes in the context where you believe it's going to reduce harm, and you use it on a regular basis, you're much more likely to see reduction. So I think it's very much society related what you see and what the expectations are from the society. Second thing I'd just like to ask about, and this is something, I don't think it's unique to San Francisco, but in our studies, where we study a lot of dual users as well as single users, marijuana use is very common. 75% of our e-cigarette users smoke marijuana. Now in our studies we tried to get them to stop when we're looking at biomarkers, but certainly if you're looking at any combustion products, including carbon monoxide, marijuana use is a very important thing to look at. I'm not sure if that's the same in Europe, but I can tell you in the US, marijuana use in e-cigarette users is probably 75%.
Right. I should say that for our UK-based study, London study, we didn't ask about marijuana. I suspect that the policy environment is somewhat different compared with California. I mean, the stance of the government changed towards marijuana, but certainly I don't think it would be as high as it is observed in San Francisco. I should say that for our study, the dual users that we looked at were actually people who have been using these products for 6 months, and most of them had been using them virtually daily. So in our study, we don't see amazing reductions among dual users who are quite committed dual users. But one of the slides I showed was the fact that, of course, there's huge differences among people, who consider themselves to be dual users when they use an e-cigarette alongside with cigarettes once or twice a month versus every single day. But the level of reduction that we see isn't great, even though these people were people who've been using them daily, e-cigarettes.
Neil, I think, is raising a very important point. The term dual use is useless. I don't think that someone who is not vaping daily should be called a dual user. He should be called a smoker who occasionally takes a few puffs of a cigarette. That's not dual use. Even among daily cigarette users, there may be people who are taking 10 puffs a day and are smoking the same number of cigarettes as before. That will create a lot of confusion, as this has already happened in Leon's previous publication, when he stated that dual users don't have any benefit. Today he showed that they do have benefits, so everything depends on how much tobacco cigarettes you consume per day. So in his publication, the dual users were smoking the same number of cigarettes as the smokers, the smoking group. I think 12.9 versus 11.9, no statistical difference. But there are dual users who went from a pack a day to 4 cigarettes per day. And these are considered, again, under the definition of dual use. So I think we have to create a much better definition, and most likely what we need to do is introduce the amount of reduction in the consumption of the combustible product. So dual user with more than 50% reduction, or more than 70% reduction. Otherwise, it's such a vague definition and term that includes so many diverse users that it only creates confusion.
Very good point. Okay, we need to draw this to a close. Just to say thank you very much again to all the speakers. If we could thank them, thank you very much. We have a half an hour break now until 11:30 and then 2 parallel sessions. Thanks.